Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the Atlantic Council's event, What is Needed to Keep Ukraine's Grain Lifeline Alive? We've got a panel of 4 speakers for you today, and so I'd like to introduce our panelists first of all, then I will invite each panelist to speak briefly on a number of topics. And then finally, at the end of the 1-hour session, we will have around 15-20 minutes for Q&A. So without further ado, then, I would like to introduce our panelists for today. We have Ivaris Abramovich. This is the former Economy Minister of Ukraine. Dr. Hanna Shelest, Chief Editor of Ukraine Analytica. The CEO of one of Ukraine's largest agribusinesses, Nibolon, Andrei Vadatorsky, and the former US Admiral James Fogo, who currently serves as the Dean of the Center of Maritime Strategy. So the issue today at hand, the Ukrainian agriculture sector. Obviously, Ukraine is famed as the breadbasket of Europe. It's long been seen as one of the agricultural superpowers of the world, a major contributor to global food security, and historically a source of a wide variety of foods for global export, particularly grains, but not exclusively. That entire trade has been significantly damaged and remains very highly threatened by the Russian invasion. So we're in the 10th month now of the invasion. Exports have been dramatically cut. The Black Sea ports of Ukraine, which have long served as the main gateway for Ukraine's agricultural exports, have been blockaded for much of the war. In the summer, we had a deal was struck with the United Nations and Turkey brokering to allow certain types of Ukrainian agricultural exports, the so-called grain deal, which has allowed resumption of exports through Odessa port, but that's on a limited level. So we'll get into that a little bit, what that deal means, how sustainable it is, and how important it is for the global food security and for the Ukrainian economy. And then in the bigger picture, we are hearing reports of a lot of farmland has been occupied, essentially stolen by the Russian occupation forces. Farmland has been destroyed, farmland has been mined. Harvests are not able to be gathered where they are able to be gathered. There's huge problems in terms of logistics to actually get products out of Ukraine into international markets. So the agricultural sector, which is so important for Ukraine, has been severely damaged by the war and is facing very difficult times ahead. So if I could invite our first speaker then, the former Minister of Economy, Ivaris Abramovich, to give us, first of all, if possible, Ivaris, an introduction, just an overview of how important, to give some context to the discussion, how important was the agricultural sector to the Ukrainian economy pre-war, and how important was Ukraine's agricultural sector to global food security?
Yeah, thank you very much for opportunity to speak. 8 years ago, I accidentally became Minister of the Economy of Ukraine. About 4 years ago, I accidentally served and became CEO and chairman of Ukroboronprom. And 15 years ago, I accidentally became a farmer as well. So I own a farming company with 41,000 hectares in Ukraine. My wife runs a CEO. This company for the last 12 years. She's vice chair of the largest association of grain growers that grow grain on about 7 million hectares. So I speak both as a minister and as someone who has been speaking farming for the past 15 years at the dinner table. We operate in 4 oblasts. 40% of our land has been occupied and liberated thereafter in Chernigov. But importance of Ukrainian agriculture in Ukrainian context and in global and European context is difficult to overestimate. Last year we had a record harvest of 109 million tons of grains and oilseeds. 20 some years ago, this was a fifth of that figure. So when I bought a farm in 2007 around Borispol airport, we would constantly go to Lithuania, France, Argentina to learn from farmers there. Now farmers from all over the world before the war come and learn the latest technologies that Ukrainian farming industry has applied. So we went through a dramatic change. And if pre-war Ukraine associated itself with some good things, agriculture was one of them. IT certainly was another one of them. So agriculture, according to different numbers, was approximately 11% of GDP, but more importantly, it was over 40% of exports. So in these challenging times, when hard currency revenues are desperately needed to somehow bridge the gap in the budget, along with assistance from foreign partners, agricultural revenues are critically important. And in the past years, more or less all grain went through the Black Sea ports. So from February, while all the companies were seeking export routes through Romania, Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary, we still managed to export absolutely minimum amounts versus what is necessary to keep the industry alive. About 8 million hectares remains occupied, which is about 27% of total. According to Ukrainian Club of Agrarian Business, the largest association, direct damages for farming industry from Russian aggression is about $6.6 billion. Indirect war losses amount about 36 billion losses, so cumulative losses for the industry, approximately $41 billion that can be quantified. And as these logistical challenges, as war challenges, destroyed equipment, storage, impossibility to export, as these problems pile up, lack of electricity, employees drafted to serve and defend the country, farming industry is living through very challenging times. So, for example, sowing campaign for the spring crops has been very severely affected, and sown crops as of now are 45% down when it comes to grain, particularly wheat. 16 million hectares sown by this time of spring crops in 2021, a bit over 8 million hectares by now. So we only see the tip of the iceberg in terms of what type of problems agricultural sector is facing. One of the severest is absolutely minimum price that farmers get in Ukraine, $150 for corn or wheat in Ukraine, at a time when price in international ports, Constanța, Klaipėda, or Gdansk, is double that. And Ukrainian farmers, unfortunately, are forced to sell below cost, which means the only recipe for survival is stable operation of grain corridor. And thank you, everyone who played a part in it, so that it's has started to function, and I hope it will keep functioning. Thank you.
Just to come back to this last point about the grain corridor that you make, how big an impact, or how much has that compensated for the economic damage? What are we talking about here? Is that what percentage of the, if we can put a figure or an impression on, is that able to sort of reduce the losses or provide some sort of a minimal level of subsistence for farmers?
Well, certainly it gave a lot of relief, but it is important that this grain corridor is working like a Swiss watch, regularly and timely and so on. It started off nicely, and inspections in Istanbul were on average 2 days. But soon they went up to 16 days on average, which meant that the freight rate, because of unpredictability of route, increased massively. at a time when global freight rates are actually coming down. So predictability in the port became a problem. Huge traffic jams started to build up both for rail cars and for trucks to unload in the port. Spot prices in the port dropped considerably. So farmer that does not have or has not had forward contracts for selling grain signed before the war, which we luckily did for 1/3 of our crop, is facing really big challenges selling crop below cost of the next year's production.
So, okay, thank you, Arvidis. Thank you very much for that introduction. Okay, if we can move on then to Andrei from Nivolon. Now, Andrei, you are active as one of the largest and most influential, perhaps, of the agribusinesses in Ukraine. What would you identify as the key impacts for agribusinesses of the war, not just in terms of economics, but also in terms of logistics, in the way you operate, in the way you're able to function as businesses?
Well, thank you for the description of our company. But first of all, I would like to say when I speak or present the current situation in Ukraine, I always have a few slides or a few theses about the company before the war and company during the war and what we are doing. Because we are allocated on the south of Ukraine, and basically the company is 31 years old, has been investing for the last 15 years into the logistics, because basically what we have learned is that the farmers understand and understood how to grow efficiently crops, and the biggest problem for Ukraine was the logistics, and that is why the company invested in total for the last 30 years more than $2 billion into the logistics. And the problem currently is that this logistics is not working, because southern part of Ukraine is occupied, and there is no river navigation. Our fleet is idle. Port of Nikolaev is blocked with vessels already for 9 months, and that is why we have this impact. And what Ivaris was talking about, the cost of the logistics, because it is an important, and it's actually the fact, because before the war we could move the grain at the cost of between $4 and $15 per ton, and currently the cost is between $120 and $150 per ton. That's actually the inefficiency what the war is introducing, apart from all the hell and to people, of course, other disturbances, but I'm talking about the numbers and the cost. But actually, and until Nikolaev is included, basically the port of Nikolaev is 30-35% of additional grain export because of the location, because of the good location in Ukraine, which is reducing the transportation cost. And until the rivers are going to be back operating, we will unfortunately see this inefficiency. So the biggest impact of the war, I think, first of all, is people, because our company, for example, lost up around 40% of people. Some of them are fighting, some of them flee the country, and it will be a biggest challenge for the company and for the country in general to return them back. So it's the first thing, because everything else could be rebuilt at the cost, with the time, but that's the most difficult, because people who flee the country, it would be very difficult for them to come back for various reasons. Secondly is, I think, even the infrastructure that we lost, the bridges, the roads could be rebuilt within 2-3 years. But the problem is going to be with the demining, because there is a rule, 1 day of war is 1 month of demining. And actually, I was surprised to dig into this area to understand the scale of the damages. And actually, you can still see demining in Kosovo, and it's basically more than 20 years ago. So I cannot even imagine what kind of an effort we need to have as a society to demine the whole Ukraine, and from time to time you see the news that the explosion, somebody killed, and it's going on for, unfortunately, for many months and years to come. And the third problem is the financial problem for Ukraine, because unfortunately, well, we were talking about the grain corridor, which is basically a good initiative at the moment when everything was blocked. Secondly, there is another alternative, plan B, is a solidarity line which is basically introduced by European Union, and there are some various supports, but nobody is talking about the financial corridor, because today Ukraine is at the war. Ukraine has problems, business have problems, so but there is no financial solution. So for example, the Ukrainian banks are suffering, companies are suffering, and I really don't want to see the banks and the Ukrainian business are fighting between each other. So there is no, let's say, common solutions for that could guarantee, for example, this country risk. The same it was done for the grain corridor when big insurance companies came and decided to guarantee the war risk for the grain corridor. But the point is that there is no financing. The grain trade is not being financed because of the risk, because of the risk associated with the country, with the companies, and it's reflected as well on the prices to the farmers. And I agree that the farmers today are forced to sell the grain at the below the cost. And the first impact we have already seen, minus 40–45% less winter crop seeding, and the impact is yet to come. And we will see it for the many years, because agriculture is very slow motion business, where you see the effect on the later stage and for the longer period. Thank you.
Now I know that Nibalon has been exploring already a number of alternative export routes to try and resolve these logistical problems. Now, obviously, we have the grain corridor in place on the Black Sea, but there's a lot of skepticism that is sufficient, that that's not going to be enough. So other options are needed. Now, you've already explored that. I understand you've been active in the Danube, on the Danube estuary down towards Romania. Can you just give us an idea of how realistic alternative routes are? What sort of percentage of pre-war trade could you relocate via other export routes, for example, via the Danube, or simply just by trucking or using trains to take products to Europe?
Well, first of all, about the grain deal, it's not really a deal. It's initiative, because I'm afraid to call anything with Russia as a deal, because basically they are criminals and they are violating the law, international law. So that is why from the beginning we never actually considered the grain corridor as a credible solution, because the agriculture and the business, it's a long-term process, and it's planning, and it's a reputation. You cannot sell today for today and get out of the country. So it's a future. You have to do the forward contracts, trade on the futures, on the forward basis, which basically the corridor is not providing. You don't know, and especially was introduced as a disruption, because as can be imagined, Russia is not interested in this grain corridor, and it's against their interest. And you can see that their vessels are not inspected. They have been exported more than Ukraine during this period of time. They export at the higher prices than Ukraine is exporting. So, and the controlling, the influencing, and playing the card of the grain corridor. So that is why we, in March, decided to invest into construction of the grain terminal on the Danube River, which is basically, we know the navigation, and we have built the fleet in Ukraine, which is stuck at the moment. but we have built the terminal during the war in Ismail, which was basically the task mission almost impossible, because the first question when you talk to the suppliers, are you working today? Are you able to guarantee the delivery? And not talking about the financing. So with regards to the routes, of course, the economy of Ukraine was not prepared for the alternative, because basically, if you look at the map, the natural way for the grain to flow is from the north to the south, and the distance is not that big. It's only 600, 700 kilometers. That's how the grain was going down to the big ports, which have been developed for the last 20 years in order to be able to export up to 100 million tons. So this 100 million tons had to find the alternative way, which is impossible. And it took for Ukraine to rebuild around 10, 15 years to have this infrastructure. And it's impossible to duplicate it or replicate it in the other places. So it's going to be a temporary solution to export something what has been grown. Of course, we all understand and predict the stagnation in agriculture, and the production is going down. So of course, we don't need to move that much grain. But that's how it goes, and we have to fight in the current circumstances and get the permissions from our neighbors, which is bureaucratic work. And even if people are trying to support, we still wait for months permission from the officials from different countries. And another alternative point is that many business people would understand is that how do you plan? When are you going to return your money on the investments? When the war is over? It's impossible. It's impossible to make a business plan today. So that is why, once again, we need to have a financial support in terms of the grants or guarantees to make those investments already today, because we don't need the uncertainty with regards to the financial side, because it has to come today. And to stabilize the companies, to have them possibility to have the standstill between the banks, which is important. The main task for the companies is to survive the war, and then be prepared for renovation, for the investments, and for the potential growth.
I see. Thank you very much for that very insightful commentary. So if we can now move on to the diplomatic side of the agricultural sector, and particularly the grain deal, I'd like to bring in our third panelist, Dr. Hannah Shelest. Dr. Shelest, we saw in November that the grain deal was extended for a further, I think, 3 months or 100 days. We also saw relatively recently a brief attempt by Russia to withdraw, and a kind of game of bluff with Turkey also saying, well, fine, we'll continue. A lot of people are skeptical about the sustainability of the grain agreement as it stands. What's your view? How stable and reliable is it? Is it going to last this next extended period? Do you think it will last beyond that?
Peter, thank you for this question, and thanks for my panelists that they took such big parts of the strategic questions in terms of the grain industry itself. So I will be able to go into the some details, not only about just question of prolongation, which is one of my list, but also a few other details, because this deal clearly demonstrated, like for the textbooks on diplomacy, that devil is in details. And when you open the text, the certain points were already there that really now harm the situation on the ground. And the Russians perfectly were aware of what they are signing and how currently they are manipulating with the agreement. And because we prolong the same type of the text, we can expect that that is, let's say, the best deal that we could have. However, what we have on the ground. So definitely one of the first questions, it is the question of prolongation. 120 days is extremely short period when you're speaking about the shipping industry. It's not only the question of the long-term planning for agriculture, but also for the shipping. If you remember July, almost for 2 weeks after the signing of agreement, ships were not going out of the ports because you needed to find the ships, you needed to find the insurance companies who would cover the risks. And the Black Sea region was as the high risk zone even in the beginning of February, not speaking of the time when the war started. Then you needed the crew that would agree to be on these ships. So de facto, the agreement was signed, or initiative, yeah, because it's even not have the legal name for this document. The initiative was signed, but then the implementation, that became the real problem, and the real nuances started to be. And then we started to go with the other issues in addition to these short-term period when the companies couldn't decide will they go for this business or not. And you can see that the big companies that previously were coming regular to ports of Ukraine, like Maersk, for example, none of them returned. We predominantly have smaller companies. We have more ships under the Turkish flag because Turkish companies were a little bit more assured by their own government that Russians will not attack probably, or will not prevent them, will not try to disturb them that much as the ships from other countries. And then it just opened the text of the agreement that being signed. And in the very beginning, everybody's called it grain deal. But de facto is, we are reading the first ever paragraph. For the exports of grain and related foodstuff and fertilizers, including ammonia. There is no word that it is just for export of wheat or barley. And de facto, what we are exporting by the maritime route now is only these two cultures. Why? The reason is extremely easy, because only these two cultures are exported in bulk, by bulk ships. All others, for the last probably at least 10 years, being exported by container ships. You would ask, what's the problem? Like, what was the issue? Because then you go to another article. Each ship going from Ukraine also should be inspected. So when the original negotiations happened in May, in June, in July, the idea of Russian desire to inspect the ships were more or less understandable, because they wanted to prevent additional weapons to come to Ukraine. So now it's just the logical question. Okay, all ships are coming to the ports of Ukraine are inspected, not to carry weapons for Ukraine, but why the ships that are leaving Ukraine should be inspected as well? And the problem is that for the inspection team, it's quite easy to open the bulker ship and to look inside what is there. But it is impossible to open each container, because for this you need special certificates, you need the additional inspection of the sanitarium of all these type of the agencies that should be there. And you understand that all those cultures like linean, like coriander, that should be exported, or flour, even let's say proceeded wheats, we cannot export them because they are not exported in this way. So even that type of the agreement that we have is not in full can be implemented. And then coming the question of inspections themselves, because that is the perfect way for the Russians to manipulate on the ground. Currently, we have approximately 150 ships expecting for inspection. For those 2 days when Russians withdrew from the agreement, when they've been manipulating the prolongation, the UN Turkish team inspected 3 times more ships than the teams when Russians are involved. Nothing changed, except of one thing, that the Russian actors are there, Russian representatives are there, and they are artificially prolonging, and in this way, disencourage a lot of companies to continue this work with Ukraine. But at the same time, we should understand that definitely the alternative routes, we should elaborate them, because we understand that it is not a short-term problem. We should expect something. But they haven't solved the situation. Those who've been traveling between Ukraine and Moldova, as I needed to travel for the last several months quite regularly, that's really just a disaster, because you have kilometers of the tracks waiting for the border control. it's not because border control is working bad. It's just because they are definitely not for this amount of the trucks and cargoes that usually we used to have exported by sea. Then you have the capacities of Constanța port. Constanța port is not that big. And definitely one Constanța port is not capable to accumulate the cargoes from 7 other Ukrainian seaports that previously exported. And for them, it is a huge question. Should we build additional terminals or not? From where to take money for investments? Will they be long-term or what to do? But also, it is a question of competition. Odessa and Constanța always been 2 big competing ports. So it is always priority to the Romanian cargoes, for example, rather than to Ukrainian. And all the small details are usually not discussed when we are talking about the success of the grain deal, because we always need to understand that it is temporary and how to, on the one hand, to use maximum the opportunities that it gave to us, but on the other hand, not to jeopardize the long-term possibilities, both for the opening of additional ports in Ukraine, because we understood that, for example, Mykolaiv port would really like to be opened, but being under constant attacks, that is very difficult. And even that will be my last point. If we read the initiative, it is a wonderful phrase over there that the two, the sides will not undertake any attacks against merchant vessels and other civilian vessels and port facilities engaged in this initiative. How do you read, as the English speaker, the port facilities engaged in this initiative? I'm reading it as the whole territory of the port with all administrations, terminals, berths, all these facilities that are there, engaged in this initiative, meaning 3 ports that have been named, Odessa, Pydanny, and Chernomorsk. How Russia read it? They are definitely reading it only as the few berths or one terminal that is involved where the grain ships are standing, because just less than 24 hours after the signature of the first edition in July, they attacked Odessa port. They've been attacking Odessa port regularly after this, and not only Odessa port. And that is also a huge question. That we are discussing the economic consequences of this grain deal, the diplomatic, but we're almost not discussing the military issues. Nobody demined the territorial waters. Nobody is going to demine. It is the natural demining happening now because of the bad weather and storms. And in winter, the weather will just be worse. So we could expect more incidents that can jeopardize the whole execution of the deal. Russian ships are still shooting from the Black Sea to the coast. So it means that any of the ships that are either in territorial waters or near the berths are under the threat. And Russia is not ready to guarantee anything over there. And these questions were not discussed. And that is the huge question, how Ukraine can really guarantee the security of those ships coming to Ukraine. That's why the question of additional air defense, additional coastal artillery should also be part of these discussions.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that very, very informative and in-depth analysis of the grain situation, the grain agreement, and the issues that are unresolved, let's say. Now, you mentioned the military aspect of it, the security aspect of it. That leads very well into our next panelist, who is a former US admiral. He's joining us from the United States. Admiral James Fogoff, if you could please begin, if possible, by discussing or sharing your views on how militarily sustainable, how militarily secure is the grain deal at this stage as it's operating? Is it something that can be something that can be feasibly extended indefinitely? Do you see any obvious problems, any obvious issues with it?
Peter, thank you very much. And Alexander, thanks to the Atlantic Council for allowing me to come on board today with such a distinguished group of speakers. Just by way of background, you're right. I'm a retired Navy admiral. I did 40 years in the United States Navy. I'm currently the Dean of the Center for Maritime Strategy, and we're very happy to participate here today. I have a lot of experience in the Black Sea. I was the commander of the Sixth Fleet from 2014 to 16, and I went back as the commander of Naval Forces Europe and Allied Joint Force Command, Naples for the southern flank from 2017 to 2020 when I retired. I count as my friends two of the former chiefs of naval operations of the Ukraine, Admiral Sergei Haiduk and Admiral Voronchenko. In fact, on a visit to Odessa, Admiral Haiduk gave me a lovely oil painting of the Black Sea. And he said, I would like you to put this in your office and look at it every day and think of us. And it is right in front of my desk. You can't see it here on camera, but I think of all my friends, Hannah, Alvarez, and Andrei in the Black Sea and what you're going through every day. Did a lot of exercises with the Ukrainian Navy, both through breeze and sea breeze. And I've been out on the Hemet Sagadashny, and I can't imagine what that commanding officer felt like when he was given the order by President Zelensky to scuttle that ship, the flagship of the Ukrainian fleet in the port of Mykolaiv to keep it out of Russian hands. We also transported 4 island-class Coast Guard cutters to Ukraine to help them rebuild their Navy. Obviously, they've been damaged in this fight. But beyond the military infrastructure, let me just talk about the sustainability of the deal. I think it is fragile, to say the least. And Hannah highlighted the fact that 24 hours after the inking of the deal, Russia attacked the port of Odessa with a missile strike. Now, just as a reminder to people, this deal involves shipments allowed from the ports of Odessa, Yuzhny, and Chernomorsk. We've talked about Mykolaiv. It's been impossible to get out of there. There's a joint command center in Istanbul. These ships are inspected by Ukrainian, Russian, and Turkish assets. The process is slow. Interesting that when the Turks and the UN are inspecting, the process speeds up. My last discussion with the Romanians was that there are almost 300 ships in the Green Corridor waiting off the port of Constanta. That puts incredible pressure on the Romanians, who are technically the host nation for those ships, if anything bad happens to them. The deal's renewable every 120 days. I agree with Hannah. That's a very short period of time. And in fact, as both Alvarez and Andrei pointed out, the Russians are moving more grain, stealing more grain, and moving fertilizer and oil, while the shipments from the Ukraine have diminished. Now, I have to give the United Nations and Turkey credit for this deal. Secretary General Guterres talked both to Western authorities and also to President Putin, and President Erdogan played a key role as an interlocutor here. Remember, the deal was signed between Turkey and Russia and Turkey and Ukraine, but not between the Ukraine and Russia. And despite the criticism of the Turks, they've actually played a significant role here. And I believe that they're much better to be in the alliance than out of the alliance, although they do have a foot in the door with Russia, and there are skeptics out there about that. But I want to keep them in the alliance. There was a rush to get this thing going because people were starving. So there was no risk mitigation plan. Hannah talked about mines. Lots of mines in the Black Sea before this conflict, even more now. And a lot of them are breaking free. So insurance rates have skyrocketed. Lloyd's of London has agreed in some cases to provide insurance, but this is a problem. And it's a more complicated problem now with this $60 a barrel oil cap, because the Turks are now insisting that there's proof of insurance for anybody coming through moving oil. And that's a disadvantage for Western nations, because you can't sell the oil unless it's at or under the $60 cap. Now, the Russians are providing these proofs of insurance almost immediately. The West, not so much. So there's another 100-ship backlog in the Bosphorus as this deal moves forward. So in August, I got together with a colleague, Dr. Mike Peterson, up at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, and we did a tabletop exercise on what does this grain deal mean and how long will it last? What is Plan B if Putin reneges on the deal? We published those results in kind of a different way. We put them in an article in War in the Rocks, thanks to Ryan Evans, who's the editor, and got them out immediately, because if we'd gone through the normal path of the War College, it would have taken a long time. So Plan B became important shortly thereafter, and just before the 120 days, when Putin reneged on the deal because he accused the West of being involved in the unmanned surface vehicle attacks on Sevastopol. I don't think there's been any proof of that. Apparently, the next Russian flagship, Moskva, was sunk. Makarov was damaged. But a few days later, Putin blinked and the grain shipments resumed, probably due to pressure from the UN and Turkey. And Putin, I think, realized that he would be an international pariah. And he was allowed to ship more fertilizer, and that means more cash in light of the economic sanctions. So it was in Russia's interest. It doesn't mean that they won't renege on this again. The recent attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, as both Alvarez and Andrea pointed out, have really slowed things down. You need electricity to run cranes. You need electricity to run phone lines or cell phones. And stevedores on the pier who are waiting to load or unload can't do their job unless they're connected and they have equipment that works. So the Russians are at an advantage. They can move things faster than the Ukrainians. Like I said, they've stolen a lot of the grain and sold it on the international market, and they're allowed to do that because they can get through. And nothing is to say that Putin will not renege again. So I come back to the original conclusion from the TTX. What is Plan B? And if we have the time, I'd be happy to share with you where I think this is going to go from a military perspective of warships or minesweepers in the Black Sea, Peter, but I'm mindful of the time.
Well, thank you for your consideration, but that was basically the next question. So please proceed. Please go ahead.
Okay. So if you look at what happened in the summertime when the Moskva was sunk, and I think everybody was surprised by that, and strikes took place through airborne drones or seaborne drones on the port of Sevastopol, Russia has started to move its Navy and even its submarine force out to Novorossiysk and to a more safe haven. I think it's time to take advantage of that and move back in. I think we ought to be taking small steps. So if there is a plan B, I'm in favor of let's get in there and let's tackle the mine problem. And the right entity to do that is NATO, and the right command is MARCOM, and the standing NATO mine countermeasures group, which I work with a lot up in the Baltic during Baltops of 2015 and 16, when I was the commander up there, are very, very effective. Now, this requires a couple of things. First of all, permission from the Turks to put these gray-hulled warships in there. But a minesweeper doesn't have a big deck gun, missiles, or anything else. It is made for purpose, and that is to sweep the mines. So we took a lot of risk coming out of the Odessa ports and the other two ports from Ukraine to drive down the coast. And, you know, normally in a military operation, you do something called a Q route. You'd sweep all the mines out, and you'd periodically go back in and ensure that there are no mines there. Now, I talked to the Romanians. Admiral Mihail Panet was just here for an exercise in Norfolk a couple of months ago. I spoke with him about these 300 ships off Constanta and the burden on his Navy and his country. And he said there was a mine spotted, and he dispatched one of the Romanian minesweepers to go out and get it. Unfortunately, in weather and as darkness was coming in, that Romanian minesweeper hit the mine. Nobody was killed, but it disabled the ship. They made it back into port, and now that ship is out of commission. That tells me they need our help. So we need to get the SNMCMG in there. And there are other assets which are perfect for this mission, and those are unmanned assets. You know, technology has allowed us to, you know, throw unmanned undersea vehicles over the side. They can find the mines. They can actually destroy the mines. And I think we've got to put some resources into that in all the $15.7 billion the United States has provided and the $8 billion that the EU has provided. So that's plan B. What's plan C? Well, if that won't work and we can't get the minesweepers in, then I think we have to look at international assets, non-aligned nations, the UN and the World Food Program, which has been very successful in the past. And I believe India can play a role here. They're non-aligned. They do have dialogue with Russia, and they do have a problem with lack of wheat. They do have a very effective Navy. So does Brazil. Brazil ran UNIFIL for many, many years in the Eastern Mediterranean. Then there's Egypt, who is also subject to the famine or starvation, as well as Tunisia and Morocco. So we should enlist their support as Plan C. Plan D, Andre and Alvarez alluded to the fact that there's another route via the Danube. That's a harder route. That's less volume, although volume has decreased through the route of the Green Corridor as a result of all these restrictions. There is another problem, and that is the Treaty of the Danube, which I believe was signed in 1948, are all the Danubian nations. Serbia is one of them. Serbia seems, with its current politic, to be more favorable to Russia than they do to the West, although the West has always had an open door, hoping that one day Serbia would come on board NATO. But Serbia gets a veto. So at least for a warship between the Danube, they can veto the transit down that passage if there were to be an escort operation, and that would leave Germany and the Netherlands out because they're further up. In the Danube, the river flows out into the Black Sea, so it's hard for mines to flow in. So it may be less of a mine problem, but once you get to the Black Sea, that mine problem is there again. And what's Plan E? Plan E is the one I think everybody worries about, and that is armed warship escorts of the grain corridor as they come in and out. That would require NATO to go in, just like we did for Kuwait during the Gulf Wars, you know, under a flag, under a NATO flag, under another nation's flag, but escorted in and out. What would happen? Everybody worries that there would be an interaction, a kinetic interaction between the Russian Navy and NATO navies or the US Navy. That's a possibility. But again, remember what I said, the Russians are moving to Novorossiysk. They're a little bit more risk averse. Frankly, in December of last year, we had three US Navy warships in the Black Sea. We had my old command ship, I love that ship, USS Mount Whitney, and two destroyers, the USS Porter and the USS Burke. They were pulled out because we didn't want to exacerbate the Russians and cause President Putin to invade Ukraine. Well, he did anyway. Now, hindsight's 20/20 vision. I think everybody wanted to avoid this conflict, but frankly, we should have left those ships in, and it would have been the normalization of presence in the Black Sea. So from a naval officer's perspective, and one who's got 7 years in Naples and about 10, 11 years in Europe, I think we've got to get in the Black Sea and reestablish the new normal, which is nothing more than the normalization of Black Sea operations prior to the conflict. And let me stop there and kick it back to you, Peter.
Thank you, Admiral. Very, very informative, and yeah, some very interesting options there. Some perhaps more politically sensitive than others, but very, very interesting. Okay, so we've now got around 10 minutes left of our session today, so I'd like to open up for questions. So I would invite our panelists to be quite concise in your answers, if possible. First question from Andrew Danieri from the Atlantic Council, who asks, how can Western investors still engage with Ukrainian agriculture in the current circumstances? So I would address this one, I think, to Ivaris, first and foremost, as someone who is involved in agriculture and also has a good eye on Western investment. If Ivaris is still with us?
Yes. In the past 15 years, there has been a huge number of foreign investors in the sector, both in logistics, in port operations, in farm management, and so on. Unfortunately for foreign investors, there are no Ukrainian assets that are being sold on the cheap. So don't expect any bargains just yet. I mean, people like Andrei just mentioned that invested $2 billion over the past years. I mean, he's not going to sell his company for a low buck, so to say. But there are plenty of opportunities in logistics. Our company out of the center is building a truck fleet. We're buying rail cars. We just finished building a dry port on the border with Romania on the Romanian side. So those that are keen to invest and take country risks hopefully manage to secure war time insurance. I mean, returns can be quite attractive.
Thank you. And then next question from Alexander Kolina from the Atlantic Council, who asks regarding the demining process. So perhaps if Andrei is still with us, I know Andrei may have had to leave already, or is Andrei still with us?
Yeah.
You are. Hi, Andrei. So if I could ask you, if I could address this question to you, just to provide a little bit more detail about the demining. You mentioned about the 1 day and 1 month equation. Where are we today in terms of your own experience, in terms of your farmland and what you're aware of in the industry? How is this going to impact the current sowing season? How is it going forward? Can you give us any idea in terms of how much land we're talking about here that is simply not active, that cannot be used because of the mining issue?
Okay. First of all, what it means demining. Actually, we have only one company, state emergency company, that is legally obliged to take care about the demining. So a few weeks ago, I had the information that 46 people were killed and 79 were in hospital at that time. Those people were trying to demine, and it shows actually how the problem, how serious the problem is. Second point is that we do not have a heavy equipment for that, because we have calculated for ourselves is that we need approximately 2 million hectares to be demined. And we need for Ukraine approximately more than 50 heavy, I would call them tractors, demining tractors, because it's a special equipment. We are currently looking at the possibility to help the state emergency fund with this kind of equipment, because today I cannot send people on the fields. Why? Because if there is a problem and if there is a mine, of course we will lose a person or have the damages, but actually there are going to be a criminal case against the director of the company who is doing that. So basically, from the legal point of view, we need to have a paper or certificate that this land is demined. And looking at the experience so far, what we have, because basically only one area was deoccupied in March, I think, from Kiev. That's the north, where Russians were, if I'm not wrong, a little bit more than 1 month. So in this area, only 407 hectares since the deoccupation took place, demined, 407 hectares. And we need to demine today around 2 million hectares. So it's basically, we have a plan for another 3-5 years for sure to do it. And the last point I would say is that the state emergency fund company that has to take care of demining, they have their own priorities. And those priorities are not the fields, it's not the business, it's social infrastructure and critical infrastructure. That's where basically they would concentrate first. Once they solve the issue, then they will come back to agriculture. So it would delay the demining process in agriculture for sure. Thank you.
We're talking about years and years here, and that's assuming that Ukraine gets the help it needs.
Actually, for sure, because basically it's not only the a shell that didn't explode, but it's actually the mine that was put into the ground and deliberately, for example, covered with some wood. So with very basic and light demining equipment, it cannot be detected. So that is why you have to really put some effort to explore, and this mine would explore only under the tractor on the truck, because if you send people with simple equipment on the fields, they will not detect it, and that's the problem. So we have to go meter by meter and kilometer by kilometer to do it, with the heavy equipment, and then it will be considered only as a safe field. And if you look at the battles, we have the structure of the land that was, with some forestry around the fields, and where basically the battles were taking place, and that is why, for the security reasons, those small forests were mined, for the protection on both sides as well. That's a big danger.
Hey, Peter, can I jump on that?
Yes,
I'd just like to say, I've traveled around the world in 40 years of active duty, and I couldn't agree more with Andrea. I spent a lot of time down in Kosovo. We did a lot of explosive ordnance disposal down in Kosovo, but he's right, 20 years after the conflict, still a lot of mines. You can go back to World War I, the Canadians at Vimy Ridge. If you go to that memorial, there's places you can't go, and only goats can cut the grass because there's so many mines. I've been to Colombia. The one thing about landmines is they move. in wet weather if they're not properly, even if they're properly mapped. Now, these mines that are around Ukraine have not been properly mapped by the Russians, and we'll never figure out where they are. It's going to have to be done with metal detectors. And lastly, in Iraq, in Mosul, to get the city back, 9 million pounds of ordnance were dropped, and there's still tons of it out there that need to be removed. So this is going to be a long-term fight. It's going to require resources, and we're only talking about the land. Think about all the mines that are floating in the sea. As Hannah pointed out, they break free in bad weather, and then they cause the kinds of problems that the Romanians had. So a very wicked problem that must be addressed.
Now, if I could come back once more to Andrei, in terms of the practicalities of this, an extension of the demining, given the restrictions on the logistics you're facing, and given the restrictions on the land that you're able to use, and also the manpower issue, the fact that so many farm employees are not available for different reasons now, have you changed the crops you're growing, your priorities, your business plan, essentially, with that in mind for the coming year?
No, of course, it's we do the calculations on daily basis, and we try to calculate the logistics, we try to calculate the price of the fertilizers, we try to calculate the prices of gas, because basically the corn has to be dried. So everything has to be calculated, and of course requires many dollars of investments per hectare. And taking into account the financial situation, which is providing limiting, let's say, possibilities. Of course, for example, this year, our company, first time since we started seeding, and we started from 1996, it's the first year that we did not apply fertilizers for corn. So the technology is really changing, even if the crops are still the same. But I'm sure that many farmers are trying to find a solution and less intensive technologies, and choosing the crop which has less volume, because basically, once again, the logistical cost is around 50%. 50%, where in US, it's approximately 10% of the price value, just to compare.
And what was it before the war? This logistical cost? It's
once again, it's a couple of percent. For the company, we had, for example, between $4 and $15 per ton, with the value, let's say, $250, $300 per ton. So it's really a little, I would say, compared to.
Sorry, is this, putting aside profits and even business growth, is this sustainable simply on the level of?
No, it's that is why it's what Ivara said, that minus 40% less already seeded for the winter crop. Because basically, okay, you can lose once, and I was surprised, to be honest, to see how Ukrainian farmers seeded corn, because they all lived with the hope that Ukraine would be liberated and the ports would start working again. And they seeded corn in May, June, so basically 2-3 months after the invasion, start of the invasion. So it's a phenomenon, So, but now, the perception and the approach is changing, and not because they don't want to, but because they cannot.
I see. Okay. Well, we wish you the very best of luck, certainly, and all the support you can possibly get. Obviously, in this situation, it is desperate, but we hope that things will improve in the coming months. We've now reached the end of our session, so I would like to thank all our panelists for their very, very insightful commentaries and very, very useful analysis. So thank you to the former Minister of Economy, Ivaris Abramovicius, Dr. Hannah Shelest, Ambassador James Fogo, and Nibelon's Andrei Vadatorsky. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for everyone who's joined us online. I hope you found it interesting, and we welcome your feedback. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.